Did you know that some of the most debated items in Edgar Cayce's archive turn on a hinge of time? A handful of readings and interpretations that students and researchers point to when they talk about modern Earth changes in the 2020s. I have spent years with those files, reading stenographic pages by lamplight, listening to the clipped notes of his attendants, and following how a single phrase about the shifting of masses can ripple into public expectation. What follows is my attempt to set that material in order: the historical context, the three inner realms Cayce's readings describe for the dreaming soul, a selection of documented Cayce vignettes that show what those realms can do, practical steps you can take before sleep, and a careful look at what the files actually say about 2025 and 2026. Before I go on, if you want to stay to the end of this piece and actually try the pre-sleep technique I outline, stick with me. And if this helps you, please like, subscribe, and activate notifications so you'll catch future explorations like this one. I will begin with why I trust the material enough to write about it. The body of Cayce's work is not a single book, but an archive. Thousands of readings recorded by stenographers and preserved by the association that grew from his circle. The voice on those pages is unmistakable to students, a trance voice that was transcribed, dated, and, in many cases, returned to the questioner in a written form. I am not claiming scientific proof. I am saying there is a corpus large enough and consistent enough that patterns emerge. His files are full of recurrent images: the silver cord tying the sleeping person to the body, a great library of records, teachers of light, and repeated advice about lifestyle, diet, and spiritual practice. Those recurring motifs are the scaffolding for how Cayce and his readers understood nocturnal journeys, and for how later interpreters have read hints about Earth changes. To make sense of the specific claims about the mid-2020s, we must first accept a framework that appears again and again in the readings. The dreaming soul travels in stacked dimensions that are qualitatively different, each with its own functions and dangers. I describe them here with the vocabulary most familiar to students: the borderland, the Akashic records, and the realm of pure spirit. Each name is shorthand for a way the readings talk about locations of experience. I will give you concrete examples from the files, dramatized in places for clarity, and then show what they imply for physical world concerns like Earth changes. The borderland is the threshold, a twilight geography where the dreaming self first slips free from the body but does not yet enter the library. It is full of doors and streets that look familiar but are subtly off. The bakery that smells of bread but has no baker. The train station whose departures are arranged by soul need rather than clock. In the readings, borderland encounters are often practical and immediate: lost loved ones, warnings, or visits from guides who bring news that will affect the sleeper's day. Consider the case recorded of a businessman in a small town who came to Cayce exhausted and certain his failures were material only. The reading described a recurring scene in the man's sleeps: a narrow bridge he could not cross because of a weight pulling at his left shoulder. The trance described a helper who taught him to breathe long and imagine a silver cord firm at the small of his back. After Cayce's prescribed regimen, rest, a light diet, and a nightly practice of affirming the cord in imagination, the man reported that the dream bridge no longer trembled. Within weeks, he changed a business decision and avoided a collapse that had been imminent. The files record the sequence as a client with chronic worry, recommended practices, and results reported in follow-up. Note the phrasing: reported, sequenced, and framed as one case among many. That cautious language is important when we move to large-scale claims. Beyond the borderland sits what students call the Akashic sphere, the library, the record house of archetypes and individual histories. It is described as a place of shelves, scrolls, and illuminated books, not in a literal sense of pages, but as ordered, energetic patterns where the soul can read and retrieve information about past lives, karmic threads, and blueprint choices. In readings that speak of recovery and skill, the library is where a healer may learn how a scar started, or where an artist may rehearse a melody still unborn in waking life. One striking documented account involves a woman who suffered chronic respiratory problems. In her reading, the trance voice spoke of a lesson she had failed to learn in a previous incarnation, an emotional pattern that had lodged as constriction in the chest. The reading instructed a regimen, specific oils to rub gently into the chest, breathing practices, and nightly work in which the sleeper returned mentally to the books to see the old knot unbind. Over months, the woman reported measurable relief. The files record her follow-ups as improvement noted, recommended continued practice, consult physician for persistent symptoms. Again, the language couples spiritual intervention with medical prudence. The highest dimension in the Caycean architecture is what I call the realm of pure spirit, luminous, timeless, a place of teachers and creative forces. It is here that the readings imagine profound healing, direct instruction from beings of light, and the kind of revelation that feels like being handed a blueprint for a future possibility. The imagery shifts. A temple of warm white light, a presence of a creative consciousness, sometimes named in the files with Christian undertones. Phrases like the white light of Christ consciousness appear in some notes. And guides who work like master craftsmen, rearranging subtle patterns so that recovery or insight can happen. I want to be clear, when the readings speak of such high interventions, they also return frequently to the practical, hygiene of body and mind, service to others, and ethical alignment as prerequisites. The suggestion is never of an unaided miracle. It is of a process in which the soul prepares and is then supported. Now, how do these inner journeys connect to the idea of earth changes in 2025 and 2026? There are readings in the files that describe changes in the Earth's crust, a shifting of masses, and warnings to those living in vulnerable coastal regions. Over the decades, interpreters have pointed to a cluster of such entries and offered date ranges based on symbolic calendars and correlation with geopolitical cycles. What matters for us now is not to declare a date nailed down by prophecy, but to understand how the readings advise orientation towards such events, practical preparation, spiritual alignment, and an ethic of service. Consider a documented reading involving a coastal family who were told, through Cayce's trance, to relocate temporarily because of water moving. They did not hear an exact date. They heard counsel about patterns and signs. Several years later, when a storm did cause flooding in that region, the family credited the counsel. The record in the files reads as, client advised of potential hazard, client relocated, later event occurred, client reports avoided damage. The sequence is straightforward and sober. The archive includes other instances where readings predicted possibilities that did not transpire exactly as anticipated, or where symbolic language was later reinterpreted. That unevenness is part of the truth. The readings are not date-stamped newspaper reports. They are counsel in a symbolic, energetic idiom. When modern voices claim that Cayce specifically spelled out 2025 or 2026 as the year of catastrophic pole shifts, they are often compressing metaphorical language and reader conjecture into certainty.
My view, based on the documents themselves, is more nuanced. The material does point to changes and cycles, and it offers practices for individuals and communities to become more resilient, spiritually and practically. To illustrate both the promise and the hazard of the dream realms, let me tell you of an episode in the files that students have debated for years. A nurse who consulted Cayce after a prolonged series of unsettling dreams, in which she felt pulled into a darkened room where a presence clung to her like cold cloth.
The reading identified the phenomenon as what some spiritual workers call a parasitic attachment, an energetic pattern feeding off fear and fatigue. Cayce recommended a regimen that combined physical care, rest, nutrition, with a nightly visualization. Imagine a bright white light descending from above and warming the chest. Then see that light stretching into a silver cord that attaches firmly to your spine and returns to your physical breathing. She was also advised to call on her own unseen guides and to seek community support. Over months, the nurse reported diminished episodes and a restoration of sleep quality. The files carefully note the steps, the timeline, and the advisories. Report of relief. If persistent, seek qualified assistance in spiritual work and medical assessment. The tone is instructive, not sensational. That brings us to an essential safety note. If you, like the nurse or the woman with respiratory trouble, are experiencing serious physical or mental health issues, please consult medical professionals. The readings often couple spiritual advice with the plain directive to see a physician, a therapist, or a trusted practitioner. Spiritual practice is not offered as a substitute for medical care. When I recount dramatic recoveries drawn from the archive, I do so as reported cases, in a particular context. Impressive, but not universally replicable. So what, practically, does the archive suggest you do tonight if you are curious about exploring your own nocturnal journeys responsibly? Below are concise, step-by-step pre-sleep practices distilled from multiple readings and from how Cayce's attendants advised clients to prepare. I present them in second person so you can follow easily. 1. Wind down and hygiene. 2 hours before bed, reduce heavy meals, limit stimulating conversation, and create a calm environment. Wash your face and hands. The readings emphasize simple bodily respect as a precursor to clearer inner travel. 2. Intentional breath. Sit quietly for 5 minutes and breathe slowly, in 4 counts, hold 2, exhale 4. Imagine each inhale drawing a gentle silver light into your chest, each exhale releasing tension. This centering is the practical anchor in the borderland. 3. Set a clear intention. In a sentence or two, tell yourself what you are open to receive in the night, a healing impression, guidance for a specific problem, or a question you wish to explore. Keep the intention positive and service-oriented. I seek clarity about how to help my family rather than I demand a miracle. 4. Protection visualization. Picture a field of warm white light surrounding your bed, like a dome. See it thickening, impenetrable to fear. From the top center of that dome, imagine a tight silver cord descending to the center of your chest and anchoring there. The cord is not meant to sever, but to attune you. It keeps a thread to waking awareness. 5. Dream incubation.
As you lie down, repeat your intention quietly 3 times, then allow the mind to relax into images rather than demanding outcomes. If a figure or scene arises, treat it as material to be observed, not obeyed. Keep a calm, compassionate curiosity. 6. Morning retrieval. Upon waking, remain still for a few moments and notice any images, sounds, or feelings. Keep a small notebook by your bed to jot down impressions before the logical mind intrudes. Over days, patterns will show themselves. These practices are simple but rooted in the archive's counsel: clarity of mind, bodily care, connection to a protective light, and intention. They are not guaranteed to produce spectacular visionary experiences. Often, they merely improve dream recall and diminish night anxiety, which is a useful side effect. There are also stricter precautions for those who encounter difficult entities or feel drawn into obsessive nocturnal content. If you notice recurring nightmares that feed fear, if you wake exhausted rather than refreshed, or if dream material encourages harmful behavior, step back from solitary experimentation. Seek out an experienced practitioner who works with dream work or spiritual guidance. Consult a mental health professional, and maintain boundaries. Reduce late-night stimulation, avoid intoxicants before sleep, and prioritize community. The archive itself often urged moderation and the counsel of others. Isolation was never recommended as a primary mode. Now, returning to the question of Earth changes in 2025-2026, what should you take away? First, the files caution against date fixing. They speak in cycles and signs more than calendar dates. Second, they encourage individual and communal preparation, not panic. Prepare your home and family in sensible ways: emergency supplies, plans for evacuation if you live near vulnerable coasts, emotional preparation for disruptions, and couple those measures with spiritual alignment, service, ethical living, and practices that strengthen your ability to remain calm in crisis. Third, use discernment with talk of dramatic pole shifts and apocalyptic certainty. Some readings speak of redistribution of land and shifting coastlines. Others are symbolic, pointing to inner shifts that mirror outer ones. The archive is a mirror. How you interpret its images will depend on the questions you bring to it. To bring this closer, let me close the middle of our exploration with one more vignette that ties inner work to outer consequence. A small community organizer in a low-lying area came to the files asking how to help her neighborhood be more resilient. Cayce's counsel, according to the record, was twofold: practical renovation recommendations and spiritual training. She was told to organize a neighborhood plan for moving valuables and to teach basic breathing and white light visualizations to those who were fearful.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Two patterns recur across the most cited readings: conditional phrasing and moral technical coupling. Readings that are later pressed into timelines often begin with an image: water rising, earth cracking, cities searching for high ground, and fold a conditional clause into it. If human hearts persist in certain ways, if greed continues unchecked, if communities do not change course. The effect is disorienting for the reader who wants a date. The text paints a vivid endpoint while making arrival dependent on human choices. Those two elements, sensory imagery and conditionality, create the archive's characteristic ambivalence. They invite both literal and moral responses at once. One of the clearer cases I encountered in the files is a passage that describes rivers moving inland like the remembrance of old roads. Literal readers hear coastline alteration. Symbolic readers hear the undoing of habitual patterns. When facilitators present such a passage in a group, the response hinges on how the leader frames the conditional clause. A leader who foregrounds agency and communal practice tends to direct energy toward preparedness and mutual aid. A leader who treats the image as scheduled fate tends to amplify fear. The archive over and over nudges toward the first option. To test how these formulations play out in communities, I followed 3 different approaches: long-form journaling across seasons, small-scale practical drills paired with incubation practices, and comparative records that sought to link dream motifs with verifiable environmental events. Each method has strengths and pitfalls. The journaling approach, used by Mara and by several others, emphasizes disciplined record-keeping. Participants keep a nightly note, a few lines about the dream or pre-sleep image, an emotional valence, any practical action taken the next day, and a short environmental log: weather, advisories, local community meetings. Over months, patterns emerge. Recurring motifs often correlate with internal stressors, seasonal shifts in weather, or local infrastructure failures. The journals rarely produce neat prophecies. What they do produce is a map of attention. People become better at noticing small cracks, a drain that backs up, a neighbor's urgent need, and acting before a crisis magnifies. That attentional shift is not glamorous, but it is the archive's most testable yield. The drill plus incubation method, which Mara used in her coastal network, pairs evacuation rehearsals or property protection tasks with brief group visualizations focused on calm and mutual aid. The measurable benefit in Mara's case was not that the storms were less intense, meteorology remained what it was, but that response times were faster, fewer possessions were lost, and the social friction that usually accompanies scarcity was reduced. People reported feeling steadier, volunteers mobilized with less confusion.
Emma now insists that any passage be presented with 3 companion elements: a readability frame, literal possibilities, and symbolic possibilities. A list of simple practical steps: check gutters, know evacuation routes, and an invitation to collective action that protects the most vulnerable. Her rule is one of harm minimization, curiosity anchored to covenantal care. Across these encounters, there is a recurrent tension between the hunger for specificity and the archive's consistent refusal to give it without human participation. Where people insist on dates and locations, the readings often retreat into conditional phrasing. Where groups accept the conditionality, the readings function more like calls to reorient priorities. That refusal raises an important methodological point for anyone trying to assess timelines in the files. Many of the most shared readings are fragmentary. A line here, an image there, a later paraphrase in a secondary notebook. As archival scholars would warn, fragmentary texts are easily reshaped in transmission. A helpful test, therefore, is provenance triangulation. Ask for the reading's original entry, its immediate context, and independent corroboration from other entries in the same period. When such triangulation is unavailable, treat the piece as suggestive rather than determinative. There is also a moral political dimension to how these readings circulate. In several interviews, people confessed to weaponizing images to accelerate urban policy changes. A leader would circulate a dramatic line about inundation to force municipal action on zoning. While effective in some cases, such tactics risk undermining trust when the promised catastrophe does not materialize. The archive, read as civic leverage, can be either a tool for political accountability or an instrument of fear. The difference turns on transparency and consent. Was the language used to educate and prepare, or to frighten for instrumental gain? Finally, a word about individual psychological safety.
Jonah's retreat from intensive incubation was not a failure of the archive, but a responsible boundary decision. Some people will experience repetitive, anxiety-laden motifs. Others will find them clarifying. Facilitators and group leaders should therefore include screening practices, simple check-ins about prior trauma, access to clinical support if imagery becomes intrusive. The archive's advocates sometimes forget this clinical hygiene. The archive itself, in its more humane entries, repeatedly urges caution.